morning, everyone, or good afternoon, good evening, depending on where everyone is. Welcome back. We're day 2 on the workshop. So just as a couple quick reminders before we jump right in, just a reminder that our workshop resource is at github.com/bencodezen, and then you should be able to find the complete intro to Vue 3 workshop in there under the repo. For today, we're going to be starting off on the 09-begin branch if you want to follow along, because I've uploaded basically a new app that will provide us some context when we're talking about project-based decisions so that you all can basically have another point of reference to. That said, when it comes to the exercises, please feel free to use whatever you're comfortable with, but just know that the C'est la Vue, which is the basically like kind of like a really MVP notion, whatever, will basically be the context in which we're talking about a lot of the exercises. So with that said, couple of reminders. So when we're learning here, the format here, reminder, is that we should learn about the concepts that we're talking about. We'll have opportunities for questions, and then we'll go ahead and apply those things. So again, the key thing is actually taking the time to try out the exercises, play and experiment, make it sticky when it comes to your learning. And then as far as participation goes, just like yesterday, please feel free to keep asking questions in the chat or raise your hand here. Again, the questions really help to contextualize things for other people in the audience. And there are some things that I might not cover if you might not have asked otherwise. So please continue to do that. And then a reminder again, in case you're joining for the second day, all slides and examples will be public on that repo, so no need to hurry up and copy everything down. Finally, again, as a reminder, all code is compromised, so I'll be providing some recommendations, quote-unquote best practices. But if in your context you find that you agree or question or disagree with what I'm saying, that is totally fine. Your opinion and experience matter, and at the end of the day, choose what works best for you and your team. OK, as far as a high-level schedule today, so what we're doing in the first half of the day is covering over some things like lifecycle hooks, async data. Then we'll be diving into the composition API, which we talked a bit about yesterday. And we're talking about and we'll be talking about styling your app. And then in the second half of the day, we'll be getting into some of the major libraries that come when it comes to working with Vue. So we're talking about Vue Router, state management with Pinia, and then sort of like the transitions, the built-in transitions for Vue, as well as a utility library that I am really excited to share with you about. And then at the end of the day, we're going to deploy your app so that you can share it with your friends, family, and the rest of the world. And then we will close out the rest of the day with Q&A. So with that said, let's jump right in, shall we? All right. So yesterday we had a lot of setup in terms of, okay, let's go ahead and go back to the playground. And let's take a look at what we have. So I'm going to start off my dev environment. Let's go into playground, npm run dev. Great. Cool. All right. So we've been working a lot with static information, right? Like basically stuff that we define ourselves. But at the end of the day, most real-world apps are going to be fetching from some sort of data source. So that's where we're going to go ahead and practice that right now. So as far as some context, what I'm going to be using for this sort of exposition of the concepts here, we'll be using the Poke API. And so basically, it's a Pokemon API that allows you to fetch things about various Pokemon, whatever. And so it's a free one that I encourage you to use when it comes to playing around with stuff. And so we did mention this yesterday, but this will be the one we'll be using for the examples. All right, so how would we fetch this normally, right? Currently, right now, if we take a look at how everything's looking, let's go ahead and start by clearing up this view right now, because obviously there's a lot going on in app.vue. So what I'm going to do is actually I'm going to go ahead and we're just going to I'm going to create a component, and I'm going to call it day1.view, and I'm basically going to copy the app stuff into here so that we have that as a reference point going forward. But I think it would be nice if app.view today started off with a clean slate. So let's do that. We're not going to worry about that. And then we'll say day 2, save. All right. So I'm going to go ahead and let's commit that over to the beginning branch, actually. That would probably make sense. Git commit refactor. Start with a clean app. All right. So here we go. We have our ability to say, OK, so what we want to do is we want to fetch the Pokemon. So the API call that we're going to be using is actually going to be this one right here. So I think I have it already saved. So OK, it's right here. So I'm going to drop that in as a comment. Let's put that in the JavaScript block. OK. All right, this URL right here, will basically serve us the original 151 Pokemon. So if we go ahead and open this up inside of our browser, you see that if we do a GET request, we'll basically get a whole list of Pokemon, fairly simple as far as the Pokemon name, and then a URL for if you want to fetch additional information about it. And so let's start with a simple request of like, how do we get this information into our app and then render that? So your first thought when you're thinking about this is probably like, OK, well, I'm probably going to use some sort of method, right? So what we're going to do here is let's go ahead and create a reactive data piece, and let's call that Pokedex. And then what we want is a method, methods that says fetch Pokemon. And then what we're going to do is we're going to fetch from this URL. So we'll use the native fetch API from the browser. And then when what we get back from the response, we're going to go ahead and actually make sure we JSONify that. So you can do that by basically using the chaining on the then. And then with the response, we'll do response.json. And so then we'll basically say this.pokedex equals this. But we're not quite done yet, right? Because this is an async request. So what do we got to do? We got to make sure we add that await keyword, and we add that async right here. Once we do that and we save, everything formats, and OK, looking pretty good. So what might we do next? OK, what we're probably going to do now is let's at least render out the Pokedex. So like this. And then let's actually show something. So 1, 2, 3. Switch on over here and save. And there we go. We see that the Pokedex is rendering. And now what we got to do is we got to fetch it, right? So you might have a button. You might say, OK, we're going to click fetch Pokemon. And then we'll click fetch like that. And then let's see what happens. If we click, hey, there we go. We have our data. But while this is great, the thing is that most of the time, we want this to happen when the page is loading. We don't want the user to actually like initiate this call most of the time. Ooh, question in the back.
Yeah, just a couple tech things. Like day 2 concept is not really going to work in the course.
Oh, that's totally true.
Because it's just later. It's just another section in the course.
Yep.
So maybe think about changing that. And then it's not a big deal, but your like title bar is different color, also for consistency.
Title bar.
Like the very top, it's like this green hue.
Oh, it's different.
It's cool though. Like how?
Oh, I forgot. It reacts.
How did you do that?
It reacts to the day. It's a time-based background. I didn't even think about that.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. How do I change the background again? I think it's desktop. Yeah. OK. Let me just. Can I just grab a dark one? Huh? Is it night shift? Yeah, I think it is. I just can't. Oh, on the previous screen? Night shift. No, it's not. This is already off. So that's not it. No, it's the, I believe.
It's not that big of a deal. I think the other thing is a little bit bigger of a deal because.
Yeah, that's totally fair. Oh, this one. These desktop pictures actually do change based on whether they're dynamic or not. So how. Oh, no, I have it only on dark. This is really. OK, there we go. Is that better? I can't remember what it was yesterday.
Was it dark blue before?
So dark was better?
That one's good.
OK, I'm going to turn it back to dark. OK. OK, we'll leave that there then.
Yeah, that's way bluer than it was yesterday, so I don't know if it really matters.
It doesn't matter, yeah.
OK.
It's not a big deal.
All right, let's just go back to the light. OK. Oh, that's interesting that it was different. Yep, you're welcome. In that case, should we just, how do we want to handle the day 2 H1 then?
Well, it was only like 2 minutes of content, so you might as well just start from the top.
OK, sounds good. Let's restart that again. OK. Never mind.
And it's not the worst thing in the world. It's just.
No, for continuity, I totally get it.
It's like.
Yep, you're totally right. OK, great. All right. Let's take it from the top then. Cool.
Sorry,
OK.
all in the room. It's over 5 minutes of content.
All right. Don't worry, I'll make sure I include everything that we have planned. All right. So when we look back in the code base, we can see that we have a lot on the page right now. But what we're going to go, let's start that over. So let's go ahead and jump back into the code. As we can see here, we have a lot going on right now. And since we're talking about kind of a new concept in regards to fetching async data, let's go ahead and clean this up a bit, right? So I'm going to migrate this over into a separate scratch pad. And so inside of components, I'm going to just create a scratchpad.view file. And we're just going to migrate everything from app.view over. And that way, you have that as reference for later on if you want to see exactly what happened. So we'll clean this up and keep this a standard new, basically a news app. Great. And I'll go ahead and commit that to the branch. Let's see, git refactor, move code to scratchpad. All right, great. All right, so the question here is the data we've been working with so far, like if we take a look at scratchpad, everything is something that we've defined ourselves. And we're assuming basically that we always have full control of the data. And if that were really the case for front-end development, I think our lives would be a lot easier. But the reality is we have to fetch data from the back end a lot of times, and we got to figure out how to deal with that. So if we take the tools that we have right now and think about how we might do that, let's go ahead and use the Poke API, which is one of my favorites when it comes to working with sample data, because I think Pokemon was a fun thing for me growing up as a kid. And so basically, this is a pretty impressive database in terms of being able to fetch things about individual Pokemon, fetch it by region. It's darn impressive. So the URL we're going to be using, I'm going to go ahead and add a comment up here, is this pokeapi.com. And you notice the main thing is that it just fetches the Pokemon, and it limits it to the first 151. So in other words, the original 151 Pokemon. So our first goal here is to say, OK, how do we fetch that data down from the back end and actually render it onto our page? Well, first thing first, let's go and set up our app real quick. We'll export default and object. And for our reactive data property, let's go ahead and just have a Pokedex array. And then again, let me actually add some items in here so we can actually see it when we show it on the page. Let's go ahead and show that real quick to make sure everything's wired up correctly. And there you go, our array is showing up. The next thing we want to do is add some sort of method, right? Because we need to actually call this thing. So you might think, OK, so we have a method called fetch Pokemon. And it will use the fetch API. And then we'll go ahead and grab this URL up here. Whoops. There we go. And then what we need to do, though, is that oftentimes when you fetch data from the back end, you need to actually JSONify it. In other words, you need to convert it to JSON so you can actually parse it correctly on the front end. And so the way you do that is you take the response that you're given and you do response.json. And so what we want to do, though, is we don't only want to fetch this. We want to actually assign this to our Pokedex, right? So we're going to do this .Pokedex equals fetch. But we're not quite done because what? Fetch is an async operation. And right now, everything we're writing is in a synchronous operation. So in other words here, what we got to do is we got to say, hey, we have to wait for fetch to finish before we do this thing. And since we need to await the thing, we need to actually make sure we tell Vue, hey, by the way, this is an async function. This is going to happen asynchronously. Great, we have our method. And so, all right, we want to fetch the thing, right? So let's say, OK, so we have a button. And when we click the button, this is when we want to run that fetch Pokemon. So fetch Pokemon like that. Great. Let's see what happens now. If we click, hey, everything's there just as we expect. This is exciting. But if we think about the real-world scenario, while there are cases where you'll be running async functions on specific user interactions, the reality is a lot of times when someone's loading a page, that's probably when you're actually going to be wanting to fetch that data. And more importantly, you want to fetch it at a specific time frame. And so this is where the concept of lifecycle hooks comes into play when we're talking about front-end frameworks. And I think most of them do have them. So let's take a look at the diagram for lifecycle hooks for Vue. And we're going to take a look at the one directly on the docs because I want you all to be able to kind of get familiar with the docs because Vue has an entire team dedicated to trying to make sure that the docs are as top-notch as they can and that basically this information is free and available to you whenever it's time for you to dive into these problems. And so if we take a look at here we can see an actual diagram of how the lifecycle works. And so you can see that Vue, what it starts to do is the renderer kicks it off, and then it runs a setup lifecycle hook, which, again, we'll talk more about later. But you can see that what it's doing is it's going through, and at each of these steps where you see the rounded, outlined rectangle, so we have setup, before create, created, before mount, all of these are different points inside of the lifecycle of a component. And what that means is you can actually basically interject different code depending on where you need it to run. So for example, you see here that what is it doing? First, it starts to encounters the component. It starts to initialize the options API. And then it starts to do some checks, basically, right? and then it starts to render the component. It'll actually mount the thing to the actual window. Basically, you're starting to actually see the thing. And then finally, if you're deleting something, it will unmount the thing from the DOM. And so to be clear, I do not expect any of you to understand like the full effect of what's happening here. But suffice to know that you can refer to this at any point in the future when you're starting to get a little bit more nuance about where you want your code to run. For the purposes of our exercise, though, we have to think about it like this. When the component, if we wait for the component to mount before we actually start running the code to fetch, we know that asynchronous calls can take a while. And what we want to do is try to improve our user experience by ensuring that users get that data as quickly as possible, which means what? We want to actually try to initiate that fetch before the component even renders to the screen. That way, call it, we try to time it so that by the time the component hits the screen, you're hoping that the async data basically has hopefully finished by then. And so if we take a look at where that is, basically the way to think of it in your head at this point is mounted is the point when the mounted lifecycle hook is when it's basically showing up on the screen. That's the way to think about it. And so in other words, you have the ability to say before mount. There's one right here. But then there's also a couple of steps happening before mount. So actually, we even have the created lifecycle hook and the before create. But there's a key thing that you'll notice here, though, is that with before create, this is happening before the options API. And so what does that mean? I think it'll be easier if I show you this inside of the code. So let me go ahead and bump this over. OK. So if we take a look at this right now, we mentioned yesterday that passing an object in order to define how our component is working is called the options API. Because we see here, there are data, there are methods. And so similarly, we have the ability to call lifecycle hooks on it. So we have, what do we see earlier? Before create was one of them. And so before create can be a function that we run. And so all I'm going to do here is I'm going to log before create. And then we're going to try to log this.pokedex. And then we're going to log the created lifecycle hook. So basically, this is how you're going to call the individual lifecycle hooks, is by basically the name right here that we see here. This is a little small right now because of the mobile responsive. And then just basically calling it as a function. That's how you actually reference it. And so when created now we'll do a log create. And then this time, this is when it's been created. And this time, we'll log this.pokedex. OK, what's going to happen here? Well, if we take a look inside of our dev tools, you'll notice something here, is that before create gets logged, but then this.pokedex does not exist. However, then once created does, you'll see that Pokedex does exist. And inside of this proxy here, you'll see that inside of the target, which you want to open up, that's where you'll see the actual value of what's happening. And so if we think about it in another way, if we rearrange this for our mental model, before create is actually happening, all this stuff below here even exists. And so if that's the case, that means that when you're using the options API, before create is probably not actually the best place to be running an asynchronous function, because at this point, nothing exists. So what we want to make sure we do then is to basically say when it's been created. Remember, created is not the same as mounted. There's a bunch of stuff happening before it's actually mounted to the page. Once it's been created, this is where we're going to say, let's kick off our function. So what we can do is we can then go this.fetch Pokemon. Now we save this, though. You'll see, boom. All of a sudden, without clicking anything, it did exactly what we wanted to, which is the user hit the page, the view did its thing to go fetch the data. It immediately showed up on the screen. OK. How do people feel about those concepts? Does that make sense? Question?
Are those hooks promise aware? If you were to return the promise to this fetch Pokemon, would it pause continuation until it returned?
So your question here is around whether the lifecycle hooks are aware. Oh, can you actually just return a promise instead?
Like would the created not continue until the promise resolves if you wanted to, like, for some reason not mount, but until the promise is fully resolved? Before
you actually move on to the next hook, basically?
Yeah.
So in this regard, like, you don't want, so run it. I don't see why that wouldn't be possible. Vue usually has ways for you to break those things apart so that you can basically stop it. And so this would be, to be clear, this is a little bit beyond the scope of the intro. So if this goes a little beyond what your current knowledge, don't worry. But basically, if you've heard of things like next tick inside of code bases, that's where people are like manually like initiating different stages to ensure that like either different frames are being skipped or moved on. And so just know that if you're trying to intentionally stop it at the lifecycle hook, you probably have to dig into it just to figure out how that will work. Because normally Vue, as you can see, it tries to optimize it. Because normally you might even expect at this point, let me go back to the code. Let me close that. This .fetch Pokemon is an asynchronous function. And so, so here's the thing. If we were to call the fetch directly here, and we did an await, okay, so let me do this real quick. And then let's just const response equals this, and let's just log response. Okay. So, all right. You'll see already that Vue is yelling at me. Because if you call any sort of, if you actually manually define it in a await keyword inside of a lifecycle hook, it will ask that you actually define the async on that directly. However, since we're not doing that, since we actually have the async already defined on the function, this is why this code still works. But otherwise, to your question, yeah, I would just dive further into how to get it to pause. But otherwise, you should be able to do what you want. Cool. OK. OK. So when it comes to lifecycle hooks, basically, I would say the ones to really know about are created, because that's usually where you're going to be running your async functions. And then if you really have something that you really want to happen like right when the component is mounted, then I've seen a lot of before mount or mounted used for those scenarios where you might want to time either some sort of animation or that kind of thing. But otherwise, just know that created is kind of going to be your bread and butter when using the options API for doing asynchronous calls. OK. And so the other thing that I want to cover too, let's go ahead and actually commit this real quick. Tig status, feature, add Pokedex, fetch, API call. Great. OK. So if we're taking a look at the code that we have right now, you'll notice that if you checked out the 09-begin branch, you'll notice there's a new project in here called C'est la Vue. And so for those not familiar with the French, C'est la vie just means that it's life, this is life, and so this is Vue. And so inside of here, we actually do have a little bit happening here. So I do want to walk through this with you, because going forward for the rest of the day, I will try to sort of centralize the exercises around C'est la Vue in order to just provide like some context and basically give you the experience of walking into a project that either has already had some, call it legacy code, and that way you feel like you're working with stuff. But that said, I want to emphasize, if you feel more comfortable just working with your TV show forum app to apply these concepts, please feel free to do so. I just wanted to provide different context to allow you that practice of seeing what it's like when working with code bases. So let's go and switch over in here real quick into C'est la Vue. And let's go ahead and run that. npm run dev. Great. And now if we open up here. Oh, it's on 7.4 now. Oh, that's right, because the other one's running. Makes sense. OK. Here we go. We have C'est la Vue. It's a fairly simple app, but it has a little bit of styling this time, so not just raw HTML and whatever the browser provides. And we have a home and login page, or at least what appears to be. If we take a look at our app.vue, you'll notice that there are two components that are already pre-built for you. There's a home page and a login page. You'll notice, though, that at this point, there still is no, actually, you wouldn't notice. OK, actually, I can show you how you wouldn't notice this. If you look inside of package.json, you'll see there's still no router library. So there's no like paths being changed or anything right now. What we're doing here is that traditional single-page application model, which is like every JavaScript trying to manage everything. And so it's just routed there. And so what's actually happening here is we have this reactive data that's tracking the state of the current page, quote unquote. And so here we have two methods that assign the current page to home or login. And then down here, we have the ability to say, OK, well, if the current page is home, show this component. If it's the login page, show, or if current page is login, or actually in this case, it's an else. But as you can see, that's like your basic check to see what we're swapping between. Now, Vue, OK, let me do that again, because I know I was drinking a second ago. Now, here's the cool thing. This right here is great, but you can imagine that list gets long. And again, for routing, eventually we're going to get into the library that allows to teach you how to switch routes. But if you have a list of components that you might need to swap in and out and make it dynamic, it's kind of hard to have that all managed out inside of your templates, right? Either the conditionals will get complicated. How would that actually work? And so, believe it or not, what you can do is you can actually use a built-in component from Vue that's literally called component. And so what this component does, let me start by, it's fine, I can delete these. me first. And so, great. Okay. So the way the native component works is that you pass it an attribute of is. In other words, you pass it what the component is going to be. So in the other case, if we just did homepage, for example, whoop. Component is homepage registered. Let me make sure real quick. It is totally registered. And I need to stop translating it. Never translate the site. OK. So the component is here, and it should return. All right, one sec. Let me pull this up real quick. Oh, site. Oh, that makes sense. Component. That was supposed to just bring it up. Yep. Oh, is it because I have it bound dynamically? That wouldn't make sense. Oh, it is bound dynamically. OK. There we go. OK, great. That was my fault. OK, let me circle back so that we can just basically explain that. OK. Cut. Doop. OK, save. That's blank. All right. So when it comes to dynamically swapping out components, Vue has a native component aptly called component. Because what you're doing is you're basically defining a generic component that JavaScript will basically help to define. So in the case of our app, for example, what we do is we pass it a prop called is. And this is a specially designed prop for the native component. And so if we just do it manually ourselves, we can say, basically we can say, oh, we're going to the home page. And so in this particular case, you'll notice that home is basically being bound to just like a plain string. And there's nothing special going on. And so if we think about it, this is really no different than just declaring your home page directly as a component, like rendering out on the screen. But what we'd like to do is actually make it something that is managed via JavaScript. And so what we could do in this particular case is we can say, you know what, let's do this. Let's create a computed property. And we'll call it, and this time, this one is called current page. And then we'll say render page. And the way render page will work, we'll say is, actually, yes, this is how it'll work. Return this.current page plus whatever. So basically, we're looking at the naming of the component here. In this case, it's homepage. And so we can see now that because, whoops, let me go back. OK. We can see now because we're only basically having the current page defined via the first part of it, via home and login, this means that we can basically tag it onto page. And if we save that now, yep, that's totally fine. And then bind this to render page. That's good. There you go. That's swapping in and out now. And so what's really cool about this now is that you basically get the ability to do some pretty complex logic things. And then more importantly, you can actually start then, when it comes to really making your application dynamic and like having the backend define maybe which components your users prefer because you're managing a CMS site that might render out certain widgets. You might actually then do a loop through your V4, or there's like a bunch of things that you end up being able to do with this. But it's something I just wanted to expose to you all because as we go through, this concept is actually going to show up again as we go through things like routing. So with that said, it's time to dive into some code. So let me start by committing this. Actually, you know what? I'm not going to commit this because I want you all to practice doing that. So let's switch over to the exercise slide. All right. Oh, right, that's what I did. OK, I got this. Let me go back. I'm going to commit this because I did have some forward thinking on this part. Git commit feature add example for dynamic component. Great. OK, so as far as recording goes, this next part is where we kind of kick off the exercise. OK, so for the exercise, we're actually going to be using one of my new favorite APIs called JSON placeholder. If you haven't heard about it, it's pretty great. Because what it does is it basically provides a bunch of static data that requires no authentication key or anything. And what it allows you to do is it has a bunch of different data sets that allow you to relate between them. So basically, we'll see here, if we take a look at users, for example. Users has an ID, has all this data ready for you. But then if you take a look at something like to-dos, you'll notice that it even has user ID and it relates back to those users. And so what you basically have is, rather than having like a dynamic database that oftentimes goes like either unmaintained or eventually goes out of service, this is really just a bunch of static JSON, but we get to request it as if it were from the back end. And so this is the API that I recommend you all use going forward when it comes to our exercises. And so for our exercise of the day, so the idea here is that you're going to be using the Say Love You app. And this time, your product manager has come to you and says, we need a user page component, right? So we're going to give you some practice as far as basically go ahead and create that user page inside the component folder. And then inside of that component, go ahead and use that created lifecycle to go ahead and fetch all the users from that JSON placeholder API using what we just showed you. And then, and then go ahead and render that however you see fit. And then go ahead and make sure you update app.view so that if you want to use that dynamic component, that it actually swaps it out correctly when you're using the navigation. And so that's a bonus. And don't worry, we'll walk through everything. But I'm going to go ahead and give everyone 15 minutes to play around with this. And we'll be back then. Cool. Welcome back, everybody. How was the exercise? All right. Yeah, it looks like people were successful. So no worries. In case you find that a little bit complicated, we're gonna walk through the solution right now. So let's go ahead and do this. So let me close that. Bring that over here. Actually, you know what I do? I do want this as a reference. I'm going to bring this as a new tab. Okay. All right. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to work in the C'est La view. Remember that if you are working in your TV forum app, you can go ahead and use whatever I'm doing in C'est La view as like an example for how the solution should look in your app. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and check out the 09 branch solution. So that's where this will live. Okay. So first thing first, what do we want to do? We want to create a user page, all right? So what we're going to do inside of our components folder, user page.view. And then I'm going to go ahead and let's set up the script block, and let's set up the style block. And so taking a look at what we have here, we have some basic styles. And so for now, I'm just going to kind of keep it straightforward in the sense that like, let's just go ahead and pull what we already have. So I'm going to actually grab, I think the login page is fine for me. So I'm going to go ahead and actually, you know what? Let's see. Yeah, I'll just grab the login page. So I'll grab the login page, copy it over into our user page for now. And I'm going to actually delete these, or I'll leave them because it'll actually be a great discussion point for later. And for now, we'll just call this users. We'll delete this stuff, and we'll just save. So now, if we go back, we're on the home page. We won't be able to see this yet. Why? Because we actually need to update we need to update our app.view so that we actually show that page. And so for now, we're just going to make it easy, and we're just going to say, okay, well, by default, we're just going to show the user page. But we want to show the user page. What do we got to do? We got to import it because we're actually going to call that component. So that way we call it, we register it. That way it can actually be called later on. So if you save that and refresh, nothing's working. Why is that? Well, we need local dev running. Let me close that one. Great. There we go. OK. So we have our user page up and running, looking good. And so what do we want to do? We want to go ahead and fetch our users from this API right here. So following our best practices, we'll do the export default object. And inside of our created, we're actually going to go ahead and run a function. What we want to run, ideally, we want something like this.fetch users. But we haven't written that. So let's go ahead and write that. So we'll create a methods here. And the methods option will contain fetch users. Excuse me. OK. Inside of here, this is where we're going to go ahead and run our request. So we might have a this.userList equals what? We're going to fetch this API. And then we're going to take that response, and then we're going to JSONify it by running response.json. Now again, this is an asynchronous request. So we need the await keyword, and we need to tell it that it's async. Not quite done yet, though, because why? We have this user list. It hasn't been created yet. This is our reactive data. So we can go ahead and create that. And so we have our user list, and that'll be an array. And then we can save. All right, everything formats. It looks good. The code editor is not yelling at us anymore. And so we aren't seeing anything yet, and that's totally fine because why? We haven't actually rendered it to the screen. So user list, there we go, we saved, and we refresh, and we'll notice, nothing is showing up. And so this.fetch users, great, fetch, placeholder, then response.json. Why is that not fetching all of a sudden? So I'm going to log here real quick. Hello. Oh, it's not even logging.
Your on the app view, your user list import had a lowercase u.
Oh, so okay, let's go back.
User page, sorry, not user list.
On user page?
The import. No, the app view, the import of user page on app.view.
On app.view of up here. Oh, but that's an interesting bug that didn't happen because we saw it actually render the H1.
Yeah.
So that was an odd import. Yeah.
I say something and then I was confused. So
Well, I'm surprised. I'm glad we caught that on the recording. OK, great. So in other words, this is a reminder that when you're importing your components, make sure that they're matched case-wise. Typically, I will say that things like Volar and VS Code will actually, the IntelliSense will try to autocomplete that for you. But obviously, in this case, it happened to, oh, I know, it's not the autocomplete. That was me doing the, I would think I'm shortcutting how to update that. So that was on me. OK, now that we do it, great. We can actually see all our users here. But we're going to go ahead and pretty that up a little bit because that is pretty hard to read. So I'm just going to do an unordered list. And for every one of these users, so user in user list, we're going to make sure, because we're using a v-for loop, we're going to assign it a unique key. And that key can just be the ID, actually, that we have up here. So I'm actually going to say, I'm going to use the ES6 templating, though, to say user.id. And the reason for this is because this data set is on the simpler side as far as keeping the IDs just numbers. And so I do know in advance that there will be other elements that also have very simplistic IDs. And so prevent that from colliding, because when it does, Vue will tell you inside of the console log, hey, by the way, I'm seeing duplicate keys for elements. And that will create all sorts of havoc for you. So try to keep them unique whenever you can. Again, normally these will be UUIDs, and you don't have to worry about it. And then we can basically render out the user.name. And then let's go ahead and just, let's just do the, what would be fun to do? Let's do their website then. And then we have user.website. Save. There we go. And we can see now, if we refresh, OK, we got a lot going on. Now, for a second here, I panicked because I was like, why are we seeing double? The reason we're seeing double is because we have the pre-elements still there. So we save that now and refresh. There you go. Much better. And now we have all our users being rendered on the page. Now let's go ahead and commit that part of the exercise so you have that. And then we add a new terminal. OK. Git commit feature, add user page with fetching user data.
Ben, is there a way with the dev tools to see the unique IDs of those items?
That is a great question. OK. So the question here is around DevTools, which actually, this is a great time to actually investigate what's going on here. So I'm going to go ahead and full screen this so we can talk about that. So let's bump this up a little. Oh, no, that was fine. So we open up our DevTools here and take a look at Vue. And so the question here is around IDs, actually. So if we actually just inspect these normally, you'll notice that there's really nothing telling you kind of what the IDs are. And so we look inside of Vue here, and we look at our components. This is where you see, here is our user list. You can see, we actually see the different components now. Now that you all are starting to get familiar with that, we have our app. This is our user page. And what's nice about the DevTools is that, as you can see, it's actually highlighting the section of the app that you should be focusing on. And so little DX improvements like that are things I've always loved about the team that works on the DevTools. And so inside of here, we can even see all the data that's in here. You see all the, basically the reactive and all that such. But to your point, at the moment, oh, by the way, what you see here is you can actually see what Vue is actually rendering as far as like the JavaScript code. And so if you want to nerd out about all that stuff and what the vanilla JavaScript looks like underneath, you can always kind of look at that. But in the meantime, it looks like at the moment, I remember they don't actually, I want to say the DevTools had a point where they exposed the key. But off the top of my head right now, it's not something that's clearly obviously being shown. That said, what I'm going to do, actually, let me make a note right now to do a look into how keys can be exposed. And we have a siren, right? Did that siren start in the middle of the question? Kind of. OK, so we can.
Someone in chat says not rendering the page. Anyways, I think you fixed that. So.
Not rendering the user page? OK. Do we know if this, can we check to see if the siren started before the question? Because I can obviously re-record the answer if that would help, but I think it started during the question.
It was 4 minutes ago you said that. Sorry, you got it figured out, he said.
OK, cool.
Who asked the question?
Online.
Oh, sorry, I was talking about the other question.
Yeah. The question about the IDs.
Yeah, could we re-ask it just in case?
Sure.
Thank you.
OK.
We ready? Ben, is there a way in the DevTools to see the IDs that are assigned to those items?
Yeah, that's a great question. So if we take a look at what the context here is that this dynamic key that we're assigning, in this case, user-1 and so forth, the question here is around the idea if there's any way to expose that. And so honestly, off the top of my head, we can see here that if we're looking at the browser DevTools, there's nothing actually indicating what the keys are. And if we take a look at View DevTools, we can see here that one of the nice things about DevTools is that it makes it very clear how you can expose the different properties of it. But it does look like at first glance, there's nothing obvious kind of indicating its individual keys. Like we can inspect the elements in here and all the data in here, so in case you're ever debugging anything. And what's a nice little bonus about this too, actually, is that the DevTools allow you to modify it directly. So if we come in here and just call, add Selena as a middle name, you'll see that it'll actually update it directly. So it allows for a kind of a quicker feedback loop in case you're wondering if your data set is doing something specific with your code. You can just play around with it right there rather than call it going back to your component and faking the data set. The DevTools allows you to kind of do that in a centralized way. That said, it doesn't look like there's anything obvious right now that showcases that. I want to say at one point I saw an ability to hover over the individual pieces where they would show the key. But what I'll do is I'm going to make a note on how that works, and then if I do figure out basically how that works, I'll make sure that on the repo we'll have on an FAQ section, call it, that we haven't answered. That way that people can look that up later on. So thank you for the question. Yeah.
I don't know how I did it. I see key 1 on user's page on mine right now.
You do see key 1 user page.
How did I do that?
How did you do? Yes, please. OK, we may have.
But I don't know how to reproduce, so we'll just.
You were in the DevTools?
Yeah, in the DevTools.
OK, you were in the DevTools. OK, we're going to spend a minute trying to figure this out. So we know it's possible. My instincts were right. Editable props.
But that's not the one that I added. That'd be on user's page, key 1, not one that I dynamically added. So I'm still not sure that.
Oh, you mean that if you just.
Yours, it's not.
What was that?
Go to your tools.
Yep.
And where yours says user page.
Yep.
Right next to it, mine says key equals 1. Right there in the green bar.
Oh, yours says key equals 1.
It wasn't there, so I'm trying to see if I've.
Is that because? I wonder.
It could just be a different version of it. Never mind.
I wonder, can I do key equals render page? Like that? Oh, OK. Great. So we did discover this at the bare minimum through this exercise. If you provide keys to your components, these are showing up in your DevTools.
Okay.
So there's something to be said where if you're at the point where you're probably debugging keys, at least for your components, it probably is helpful to, to be honest, if we're thinking about a real world scenario, the user page would be displaying probably a user card component. And then those should show those. And so for the sake of actually demoing that, because this is actually something that does occur in apps, so let's do a user card real quick. And then I'm just going to go ahead and drop that. We're going to drop this li. We're going to keep it simple. We're just going to assume all user cards are always list elements. And then not going to worry about that piece. And then we're going to go ahead and quickly just define a prop. Default props. And they'll get a user type of object. And required is true. Save. And then inside of user page now, we can actually import said user card. And then there we go. Just use the autocomplete for that. And then the components. There we go. And then again, dropping user card in here. And then we can then say user card is what we're going to use here. We're going to not worry about that. And then we're just going to make sure we pass user inside of here. Like that. That should self-close, save. OK. That should do the trick. It looks like everything's working. And to validate this real quick, what we're going to do is we're going to add a quick CSS class called user card. And I'm just going to say user card has border 2px solid. Let's just keep it simple. Let's just do a black. And then just a padding of 10 pixels. There we go. OK, so our cards are rendering. We have our user page here rendering our list of cards, which looks good. And now, if we go ahead and now open the DevTools, we should see, which I think I saw a glimpse of that a second ago. There we go. The keys are showing up in this case. So it does look like if you want to inspect the DOM element one, that remains to be a little bit elusive. But that said, it's still a worthy question worth investigating into.
On the topic of keys, are those keys, do they need to be unique on a globally all items rendered on page, or is it kind of scoped to the component? So if your component renders one list, is it safe to just use key 1, 2, 3, 4?
Yep.
Okay.
Oh, sorry. The yep was acknowledging the question.
Gotcha.
Okay. So the question here is around the scoping of keys, right? Because we talked about scoping of data, right? Data is scoped to the components, and we have to be very explicit about how it's shared. Keys, however, are different because it has to do with whatever's on the page. So there's no scoping in regards to keys. And this is very important in particular when it comes to animation and transitions, is because if you want Vue to start managing some of those pieces, those keys do really need to be unique. Otherwise, you'll start seeing weird glitches of like Vue trying to calculate how to move things around and like 2 or 3 things at once. And so, yeah, I would treat keys as a universal thing. This is why, knowing the data set that I have, let me close this. Knowing the data set that I have, that is why I prefixed it with user, so that later we can have like photos or comments or whatever we decide to extend upon. So, good question though. Cool. Now, the last thing we need to do to wrap up this exercise though, is we need to actually make sure we have the ability, whoop, something broke. What broke? Did my HMR break? That's fine, we'll restart the server. 173, there we go, okay. So we have the ability to go back here to home and log in, but we don't have a user link, so let's actually just make sure we wrap that up properly. So for now, we're just gonna keep it simple here. You might notice though, when you're inspecting the nav, that I'm doing something a little bit hacky. One is that this is technically an anchor link, but the anchor link doesn't go anywhere, it technically goes to the top of the page. But on the click event, you'll notice that I'm adding this modifier .prevent. And so if you're not familiar with this, think of it like a form. Form is the one where I typically show off the prevent. And so what happens a lot of times when you have forms on an HTML page? You want to actually stop the event from submitting and then do some stuff before you submit it. And so typically what do you have to do? If you had a submit form that was like submit registration, inside of your submit registration function, you'd have to run what? You'd have to get the event. You have to run event.prevent default. Well, Vue was like, wait, we do this so often. Why is that code polluting really logic that's separate from it? That's really just basically a logistical implementation. So by adding .prevent to your submit, it automatically basically executes on that prevent default event so that your code can be cleaner and you don't have to worry about, basically it's easier to modularize things. Because otherwise your functions have always this context of being attached to an event, which might not always be true. So this is just a kind of some syntactic sugar that's useful, that's being used. And so in this case, I'm using click.prevent to prevent it from actually doing the navigation. Again, to be very clear, this is hacky because, right, we are going to get into official routing, and so we can change URLs and those sort of things. But for the sake of practice right now, this is why we have it. All right, that said, we have an href. Again, following just the same model, click.prevent. And this time, we're going to show user page. User, that looks good. And then here, show user page. This.current page equals user. OK. OK, that looks good. So let's go ahead and commit that. Boom. Update navigation to show user page. Great. Push origin 09 solution. Great. OK. Git checkout branch 10 begin. All right. Any other questions before we move on? Oh, OK. We're going to take a 5-minute tech break.
The sushi is here. I don't know what it's here early.
Very early.
That's pretty early.
We can do 11:30 lunch or something.
OK. So should we do like a 10-minute tech break?
No, they only need.
Oh, OK. We'll be back in 5 minutes.
Thank you.
Yep.